Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Monday. It is the 28th day of December in the year 2015. And, of course, as we move towards Friday and the first of a new year, it's hard to believe that 2015 is almost over. I know this time of year, you run into people that'll say, I can't wait for this year to end, and other people will say it's been a good year. And I guess if you've got your health and you have the people that you love and who love you around you, I guess it's a good year. And the movement from one day to the next on the calendar doesn't materially affect that. So I do welcome you to today's program. I hope that everybody's Christmas holiday was a good one, was a joyous one. There's absolutely no question but that the weather at least has been cooperative. The temperatures are incredible. I mean, here in southern Appalachia yesterday, we were in the low 70s. A little bit cooler than that today, and dreary and overcast, and threat of rain and some wind kicking up and dampness in the air and all of that. But my heavens, we are at the end of December, and we really haven't had any appreciable winter as yet. We had one exception, one Friday night, a week before last, and it was pretty harrowing here. We had about a quarter of an inch of snow, but it all froze into a black ice situation. It was very, very bad. But anyway, welcome to the program. Welcome to a new week of programming. I do anticipate that we will be here each day, unless something unexpected happens. I do believe that we will be here for our regular 3 programs this week as we move towards New Year's. I trust that as the professional football season winds down, with one more week left before the playoffs begin, I trust that everything is going well there for everyone. Of course, naturally there's some joy and some some non-joy. I do know quite a few Pittsburgh Steelers fans that are gnawing at their index fingers this morning over that team. But be that as it may, it is Monday. We are together here at the Virtual Center, and it is a pleasure to be with you. I do hope that you will feel comfortable in calling. If you have concerns, questions, ideas, suggestions, just comments on some of the issues we've been dealing with, I want to get to that in a moment, because I want to pick up on where we were when last we were together this last Tuesday for the beginning of our program. But I do encourage you to call, and we do have a phone number, and it will get you on the air. It'll take you directly to the Head On Radio Network studios, and you'll be on the air. By the way, Bob Kincaid or someone will answer the phone. So when you call, you don't immediately go on the air. So please don't worry about that. Somebody will receive your call and then put you on the air. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate with me via email, and several of you have, and I appreciate that very much. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906 @gmail.com. And then finally, I do remind you that we have a Facebook page devoted to the Virtual Center. If you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will that will take you to our Facebook page. And as I've mentioned over the last couple of weeks, I've put a number of items on there. I put one on there last evening, which was pretty much of a summary of our program last Tuesday. And I do want to begin our program today, our formal program today, with that particular summary, because I think it's a good way to begin. And we ended rather quickly last Tuesday with greetings for the Christmas holidays, and really didn't have the time to go back over and to review and digest some of the content, some of the materials that we were looking at. So I'd like to take that up first today before we do anything else. Let me share with you one or two things which I think are pertinent. I mentioned my email address, and I mentioned that a number of you have availed yourself of the opportunity to drop a line on the email, and I do appreciate it very much. One of the emails that I got this week, which was just a one-line comment. It wasn't anything extensive, but it was very, very appreciated. It referred specifically to our last program on Tuesday of last week. And it basically referred specifically to the last 15 minutes of that program. And the emailer, Roger, was quite complimentary about the program and about the last 15 minutes. And I believe that I acknowledged the email and thanked him very much for his very, very kind comments. But yesterday afternoon, I was thinking about today's program, and specifically I was thinking about Roger's reference to the last 15 minutes of last Tuesday's program. And I knew basically what I had talked about that 15 minutes, but I was a little bit uncertain as to exactly what I said about it, if that makes sense. I knew that in our last 15 minutes last Tuesday, Bob called in. Bob Kincaid joined us in the conversation, and we were talking about the program as it was nearing an end. And I made a point that there was one more point that I wanted to make before we went off the air, and that was John Locke's position on charity. And I remember reading the paragraph from John Locke, and then highlighting one or two lines of it. And I do want to revisit that here in a moment, because I think it is quite significant. And so that I was pretty sure was what Roger was referring to, and I concluded from that because he made a point that he was very appreciative of that 15 minutes. He said something to the effect for him it was a Christmas present of some sort. And it made me feel very good, of course. I appreciated the compliment. But I was thinking more specifically about what there was about that particular content that might be seen as a Christmas present. And I concluded, and I'm just guessing that I'm correct, but I'm assuming that this particular item about John Locke's position on charity filled a gap, or basically brought to a head a point that maybe was a little bit vague or a little bit uncertain up to that point. In other words, it nailed down a particular point of view for Roger. I know it did for me. And therefore, that's the reason that I saw it as being very significant, and I kind of concluded that so also did Roger. But anyway, my point is that yesterday afternoon, when this particular issue was on my mind, I sat down and I visited the whiterosesociety.org, and I brought up last Tuesday's broadcast, which is all the programs are archived there by date. They're all in series, the most recent one being at the top, and then they run consecutively down by date from that point. And I knew that our two programs last week, the Monday program was on the Common Core, And the Tuesday program was on the changed meaning of happiness. And it ended with the John Locke statement on charity. And so I thought to myself, well, maybe, anyway, I went to the whiteroadsociety.org and I brought up the program, and I sat there and I listened to the whole program. Because I had a feeling that at the end of it, that this was, one of those programs that seemed to be, in my mind, pretty effective. I mean, my wife made the comment after I got off the air how I thought the program went. I said I thought it went pretty well. Things seemed to click. Things seemed to come together. I didn't find myself wandering around or losing focus or any of that, which happens, and I understand that. So I listened to the program again, and one of the things I appreciated in listening to the program was how difficult it must be if you're a listener out there to call in, because I was really rolling at a couple of points there, and I thought to myself, it would be difficult to call up and in the middle of this and say, can I stop you for a moment or whatever. And I kind of made a mental note to myself that I would make reference to this at the very outset of today's program. I've mentioned this before, but I really think that it's worth mentioning again. The purpose of the program is basically determined, or the success of the program is determined from your perspective, not mine. And what I mean is, this program is, I'm not doing these programs primarily to satisfy my own needs. It does do that. There's absolutely no question. I won't deny it. I get tremendous satisfaction and pleasure out of doing this because I really do love the material and love getting into the material. But the purpose of the program is basically to bring information and insight, hopefully important insights to those listening. And so ultimately, if we were to weigh as to where the balance lies, or where the emphasis ought to be, the priority is always on the audience's end, not on my end. And what I mean is, it's what you would derive from this as a participant, as a listener at the virtual center, that means the most to me. And so therefore, if you've got something to say or something to ask or a comment to make, it always is the priority. Always. And the fact that sometimes I get rolling along and get into the material to the point that it seems a little bit awkward, probably from a listener's perspective, to call in and theoretically interrupt the train of thought or whatever. I understand that, and after listening to yesterday's broadcast, I appreciate it. I appreciate it even more. But the fact of the matter is, your call, your comments are always welcome and always are the priority in this program. I have mentioned many times, I know, and I'll mention it again, as to how I do these programs. I have materials, I have notes, but my notes are primarily the materials themselves. For example, I have in today's program, I have a copy of Chapter 5 of John Locke's second treatise on property, because I really believe that the program we did on Tuesday seems to warrant seems logically to lead into a more detailed treatment of that particular topic. So I do want to do that. And the more I think about it, the more I appreciate the fact that it's quite important. John Locke and John Locke's position on property and the role of government to protect that property is critical, because to the nature of our entire political and constitutional system. And the more we can understand it and the more we can appreciate it, it seems to me, the better equipped we will be to deal with questions and comments and issues related to that constitutional system. And so I believe it's a worthy venture here at the Virtual Center. So I have a copy of that document. And as I always do when I read a document or a text of any kind, I make, underline certain things. I make notes in the margins about this is very important. This particular paragraph is critical, those kinds of things. But beyond that, that's really the extent of the preparation. In other words, I'm not operating from a script or from a set of typed notes or anything like that. And when you're on a program like this, which today, for example, is a 2-hour program, 2 hours is an incredibly lengthy period of time, it seems to me, if you're dealing in materials. And so I trust that what keeps me on track is the material, is the content itself. In other words, I have faith in the fact that the material that I have, that I think is worthy of our time and attention, that material itself will keep us on track, and that I'll be able to move from one issue to the other smoothly enough that the transition will not appear to be difficult or awkward or inappropriate or anything else, but that one thing will lead logically into the next thing. I trust myself to that, to do that. So consequently, the fact of the matter is I literally enmesh myself in the material. And it keeps, and I get excited about it as I do that. And I truly believe that excitement makes for a better broadcast. I hope it does. But that's what I do. And so the fact of the matter is I trust the content to keep me on track and keep me focused and keep me logical and all the rest of it. I don't have notes. But I don't want that to deter you, the audience, from feeling comfortable in calling or raising a question or making a comment or whatever. Bob did that on Tuesday, and I appreciate the heck out of it because I think it's important. Bob, I can remember specifically what his point was when he called, and it was so appropriate. It was so timely because we were talking about community. John Locke was talking about community. And what we were basically saying is that a lot of people who have used John Locke for their own agenda, for their own purposes, tend to dismiss or to downplay John Locke's commitment to community and rather to play up his idea of individual freedom and the individual's right to property and the protection of property and all the rest of it. And there is a general sense amongst the general population out there who is familiar at all with John Locke, that John Locke's priorities are always the individual, the rights of the individual, the property of the individual, etc. And so therefore there's a general impression out there about John Locke, for those people who are familiar with him at all, there's a general impression out there that John Locke really isn't that committed or doesn't think that much about community. Well, the fact of the matter is what we saw on Tuesday is that John Locke puts a tremendous amount of weight on community. So the question then is, if John Locke puts that much attention to community, how is it that we don't know that? In other words, why is it that when we hear the name John Locke, we think of individual freedom, we think of property rights, we think of limiting the power of government to the protection of the individual's property and all the rest of it? In other words, very, very little, if any, attention is paid to John Locke's concern or commitment to the idea of community. And the fact of the matter is that's the whole theme of the program. is that the theme of Tuesday's program was basically that throughout history, those people with power, influence, and wealth in society have been able to exert the kind of influence on the priorities of the period in which they live that they really dictate the history of that period that we get. In other words, when we get the history or we get the records of that period, we get their record. We don't get a record of the period. We get a record of the period as interpreted by those with power and influence in that particular period of time. So basically, what we're saying is that it seems in history that those with wealth and power and influence at their own time are able, as a result of that, to dictate how the history of that period is written, what the priorities are of that particular period, and what the priorities of that period are not. And so obviously those people who find things in John Locke that they feel to be very, very important in order to support the particular agenda that suits them, they highlight that. And they downplay or dismiss or discourage attention to other aspects of John Locke, which don't fit in necessarily to their particular framework or their particular set of priorities. So the fact of the matter is, those people who are most intent on promoting the idea of individual freedom and individual success and the idea of protection and celebration of success and minimum powers of government to regulate and control and manage that success are very, very much inclined to dismiss or downplay whatever there is in John Locke that relates to community. And it tends to give us a skewed view of John Locke. And the point that I was trying to make on Tuesday was that John Locke and community go hand in hand, that there's the community to John Locke, I believe, as I read him, is quite significant. And at that point, Bob Kincaid recognized that there was a contribution, there was a comment that seemed to be very appropriate at that particular time. And it was that Margaret Thatcher had made the point that there was no such thing as community. And so that really said it all. I mean, that was exactly the point. And Bob called and made it at the right time, joined us and made that point at exactly the right time, and it added a tremendous amount, because that was really the issue, is the fact that so many people have a vested interest in discounting community that they tend to dismiss it in Locke as well, to the point that Margaret Thatcher, and of course Bob's point was the link between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and what we're talking about in our society today is the influence that Ronald Reagan had on our particular community, on our particular society as we exist.
Hey, Dr. Bill.
Hey, Bob.
You have John out on the roads of the Great Mountain West calling for you.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thanks, Bob.
Go ahead, John.
Hey, John, how are you, my friend?
Oh, I'm short, fat, and cute, usual stuff. Go figure.
Merry Christmas to you, John. Were you able to spend Christmas off the road?
No, I am part of the part that keeps the rest of consumer society running. So.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Anyway, you sound great.
Well, for the moment, in case I'm running through Vail right now, so if I happen to fall off the grid, I apologize. But the thrust of my question was, and we'll chit-chat for a few minutes, then I'll jump off the air.
Okay, Bob. Okay, John.
I kind of, back in my early days when I was skinny and had a life and all that good stuff, I used to lean libertarian, although I eventually regained my sanity. But and one of the kind of the curious things about it is that would it not be in relation to what you're talking about, the Locke's treatise and stuff? Would it not be logical to say that property ownership is to a large extent illusionary? Because if you don't pay your taxes or you don't pay your, whatever to the government comes and takes your property away. Mm-hmm. So it kind of tells the tale that maybe it's only your property for as long as you're able to, pay the ransom for it. And then as soon as you stop paying the ransom, it's no longer your property.
Well, John, I understand where you're coming from and what you're saying. How do you deal with things like leaving it to your heirs and things like that? About willing it to your children or something. I mean, because the reason I reacted to the reason I'm reacting to what you're saying is because here in West Virginia, because so much of West Virginia's wealth is underground, that there are provisions in people's deeds which suggest that they really don't own their property. And that's one of the things in West Virginia that I found particularly unique is the fact that many people years ago willed away the mineral rights to their own property. And so while they may own the house that sits on the land, whatever wealth there might be underground doesn't belong to them. And
I mean, you see that now all the time when you got places. I was looking to buy some land out here in the West, and it's almost built into almost every sales contract there is, especially in places like Texas and Montana and stuff. It's specifically stated in the sales contract that mineral and water rights and things like that are not part of the purchase. Right. And this kind of stems off of things like what I was talking about is and the short example I can give you is my father, bless his uneducated hide, he had bought land down in Southern Virginia years ago, mind you, and it had lots of nice timber, but because it was but later on the federal government along with the state passed something called Chesapeake Bay Watershed Act, which in the short version of it, when he went to try to do some timber cutting and stuff like that to improve the land, he was told, oh no, you can't do that because the act says that because this is a source feeder for the Chesapeake Bay, it has environmental problems.
Right, I understand.
So a lot of the value of his land was taken away from him without anything, and no compensation of any kind.
Right.
And so, the thrust of my question is you could, and I'll jump off and let you expound on it as much as you care to, is that property rights are, they're subject to being adjusted and according to whoever's running the power system. The leadership. So for that, I will bump off and let you chew on it as much as you wish.
John, thank you so much. And again, be careful out there, okay?
Today is easy. Yesterday was bad. Today is easy.
Okay. Well, John, thank you, my friend. It's great to hear from you, and I appreciate the comment. And the issue of the illusion of property ownership that John is referring to is quite significant. One of the things that I do want to get to later in the program today is John Locke's position on property, because he basically talks about that. And he talks about the value of land and the extent to which mixing one's labor with it is what brings value or adds value to the land. And Locke's position is that when you bring money into the equation, when you bring a specific, quantifiable, measurable way to assess value, to put a number on it, then suddenly many of the rules and regulations associated with property and with the public ownership of property become questionable. In other words, Locke's this, and I'll be getting to this hopefully, later in today's program. If not, we can perhaps look at it a little bit tomorrow. But Locke makes the point throughout, the same point that John just made, and that is the idea that in the beginning, property in the state of nature, property as personal property didn't exist. It was all common property. It was what we talk about under the heading of the commons. And so because it was under the heading of the commons, then the process of privatizing a portion of the commons, of making it your own by mixing your labor with it, is not just a personal issue, it's a community issue. Because Locke is very, very careful to point out and to emphasize over and over again that what you do to the commons, to what other people own, the commons belongs to everybody. So while there is the potential for privatizing a portion of the commons, it must always be weighed against the best interests of everybody else. In other words, if you seek to privatize a portion of the commons, then one of the considerations needs to be what the impact of that becoming yours would have on other people. If privatizing that portion of the commons is going to negatively affect other people to the point that there's not enough left for them, then theoretically you are not entitled to do that. If you try to appropriate more property than you can use, if you are claiming ownership of property way beyond what you need or what you can use, then that is not legitimate privatizing of property either. If you take more than you need and it spoils or it rots or it's not properly developed, and Locke spends quite a bit of time talking about the extent to which man's labor results in an increase in the value of property. And he makes the point that by mixing your labor with property, you make that property more productive and therefore more beneficial to the community at large. And that's why you can only privatize as much as you can use. If you take more and it lies fallow, it ceases to be productive. And because you claim ownership of it, therefore you deny others from making that land productive, then John Locke's argument is that you really are stepping outside the bounds of your legitimate rights, even though you do have rights. So when you privatize a piece of property, that's when it becomes private. That's when it becomes yours. But I don't want to lose the point of John's call. Because John's right that the community, or as John's talking about, government in the name of the community, still claims or holds to some particular say over what happens. The mere fact that it's your property doesn't give you the right to do anything you want on that property or with that property. And I think his story about his dad and the Chesapeake Bay is a classic example of that. That if what you try to do is going to negatively impact other people, then in society, once government has been created, then government in the community's name will intercede and prevent you from doing it, so that your ownership of property is somewhat limited. Locke does point out, however, and this is the point that I was getting to in relationship to John's call, is that the introduction of money, of gold and silver, which have value primarily through some sort of social agreement. Society agrees on the values associated with money or gold or whatever. And Locke's position is that if you transfer a property for money, then however much money you accumulate individually really doesn't affect negatively others around you. So in a sense, what Locke is doing is establishing a difference between accumulating property for the sake of accumulating it, which you don't have the right to do, and selling it. If you sell it and receive money for it, then Locke's position seems to be that as you continue to accumulate money, how much money you have doesn't really affect the opportunities available to other people around you. But the fact of the matter is, in today's world, we know it does. That this is really has tremendous impact on the growth of inequality in our society today. Is the amount of it's not the amount of money in in gold or bullion or anything else. It's the amount of the impact that the amount of money you has on the value the values of what other people have as well. So I think I think there's an issue there of attention, but I think John's position is quite right, and I think Locke would subscribe to exactly what John's saying. And that is that while you own it, you don't own it exclusively with the right to do anything and everything that you might want to do with it or to it. Because because what you do affects the community at large. But let me pause here and say that this particular issue right here is, I think, quite the significant point. The mere fact that the community always retains a role in the face of privatizing property, that while you can privatize a piece of property by mixing your labor with it and making it your own for your own benefit, that's opportunity. That's the exercise of freedom. And Locke makes the point that it's that process of mixing your labor with property that increases the value of it and makes it potentially more beneficial to everybody around you. But the point I'm trying to make is the fact that you never totally separate the community's involvement in what you do with your property is, I believe, the critical point. And I think John has nailed it. And what that means is that in the state of nature, in Locke's state of nature, reason is the law of nature. In other words, all there is in the state of nature is man's reason, man's common sense, man's logic. And that man's reason would dictate in the state of nature that if you take too much and claim it to be your own, you would be potentially infringing on the opportunities available to others. And common sense, reason, would tell you that you can't do that, that you shouldn't do that. But Locke's argument in his second treatise is that that really becomes the justification for government. That really becomes the basis or the rationale for the value of the so-called social contract. That reason and common sense don't always work. And the fact of the matter is, if people choose to ignore what common sense tells them, then there's no way to enforce that common sense. There's no way, there's no power of enforcement or coercion. And so therefore, Locke's position is, in the second treatise, that man's reason tells him that it would be so much more convenient and so much more efficient and effective if man created a government to do those things for him, to enforce common sense for him and for others. That would free you up not have to enforce the law of nature yourself. And so that becomes the basis of the social contract, which limits government to the protection of natural rights to life, liberty, and property. That's Locke's whole rationale. The key, it seems to me, is the transition from the state of nature to organized society under government, under the social compact. It seems to me that if government is created to fulfill the reason and common sense that existed in the state of nature, then it stands to reason that government should have the same control, the same power, the same influence in society that reason and common sense had in the state of nature. Locke says that in the state of nature, man's reason is the law. The law of nature is man's reason, man's common sense. It stands to reason that the social contract would not alter that. So therefore, the people's government, created by their consent, would seem to me to have the same powers and the same influence and the same prerogatives that reason tended to dictate in the state of nature. And so therefore, if common sense in the state of nature told you that you couldn't privatize more than you, or accumulate more than you can use, then it would stand to reason that that same thing would be true under the social contract by government. It just makes sense. It would stand to reason that if the need to be able to enforce law is what gives rise to the common sense to create government in the first place, then by implication, the government you are creating would have the authority or the power to do what reason couldn't do in the state of nature. Even though government is carefully limited in the social contract to the protection of life, liberty, and property. The arguments that people try to make today that government does not have the power to control success or limit success or tax overtax wealth, and that government ought to be celebrating success rather than making it painful, is an effort to deny government the power that I believe John Locke felt it had to have. I believe these people who are trying to make their case in the name of John Locke must deal with John Locke. And the fact that John Locke himself says in his treatises on civil government that government retains certain authority and certain power, that government's job is to represent the best interests of the community at large. And if in the state of nature, that best interest of the community meant that you should not be allowed to privatize more than you need, then one would have to conclude that government under the social contract would have at least the same power and the same influence that reason had prior to its creation. And so therefore, my interpretation of Locke is that Locke himself refutes the claims that these people try to make in his name, that they are taking him out of context. They are misinterpreting and misusing him for their own particular purposes. And that Locke himself gives us the best argument against efforts of those who would try to do that. And this is the same effort that is involved in the desire or the initiative to argue that Thomas Jefferson's pursuit of happiness really meant property because Locke said property. In other words, by making Jefferson's Declaration of Independence exclusively Lockean, then they are able to link happiness, Jefferson's happiness, with property, back to John Locke. And thereby, once they are able to include property in Jefferson's Declaration as an unalienable right, once Jefferson's unalienable rights become life, liberty, and pursuit of property, then government's role in relationship to property is severely limited. And that's what they are trying to do. That's their agenda, is to minimize government's role over their property by denying that government's principal job is to promote the general promote the general interest of the common good. And rather, that government's principal job is to protect people's unalienable rights, which means protecting their property. This seems to be the crux of the whole issue. And that's why I think that drawing out Locke's position on community and the continued influence of community, and by implication the influence of government under the social contract, is the only way to refute these people. And that's why I believe, as we talked on Tuesday, that's why I believe there's so much concern and so much opposition from certain sources to the Common Core. Because the potential of the Common Core is to bring to the surface many things, many issues, many perspectives that these folks don't want to ever see the light of day. By keeping the general population in ignorance, and I don't mean that word negatively, I just mean not knowing. I don't mean, inferior intelligence or anything else. All I mean is, by keeping the general population in the dark on some of these things, that perpetuates their opportunity to continue to define truth for the general public. Given the absence of any alternatives, truth becomes whatever the textbooks tell them, whatever the teachers tell them, whatever the curriculum guides from the state tells them. In other words, in the absence of any alternative to truth, these people have the opportunity to define it. Not only to define it, but they have the power to perpetuate it. And so it is their position of influence and power over what we know and what we don't know that is at issue here. I really think that's the basis of the concern and the opposition to the Common Core. I believe that's really the point of Tuesday's program. And as we move towards the top of the hour, we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left before we reach the top of the hour. If I can lay my hands on it, I'd like to share with you once again Locke's position on charity. And let me make the point that I made Tuesday, but let me make it again because it kind of happened so quick at the end of the program on Tuesday that I'm not sure that all of this was, was as clear as it ought to be. John Locke wrote 2 treatises on civil government, not just one. The John Locke that we know is based on Locke's second treatise on civil government, in which he talks about property, he talks about man's transition from the state of nature via the social compact into organized society, civil society, the creation of government, the limitations on the power of government, the mission for government under this kind of a charge, and all the rest of it. And more important than anything else to Locke is the idea of consent. is the idea that government speaks for the consent of the people, of the community. And that when government violates the consent of the people it governs, then the people have the right to overthrow that government. In other words, to terminate the social contract with that government and to replace it with yet another contract, create another government that will subscribe and abide by the social compact, the social contract. That's the key. I know that when I took a course in college in political science, at the time it didn't make any sense to me, but I can remember the professor telling us that there were really, in John Locke, there were really two social contracts. There were really two contracts at issue here. The first one is the agreement among the people to leave the state of nature and to form a community, form a society. The second one is the contract that that community or that society creates with government. When Jefferson in the Declaration talks about the people's duty, not just right, but duty, to overthrow a government that is in violation of the social contract, it's the second contract that is being violated, not the first one. In other words, you don't revert all the way back to the state of nature and start all over again. Once you enter into the initial contract, which is the leaving of the state of nature and the creation of an organized community, you can't ever go back. Now your only options are to contract with the particular government that the people consent to allow to govern that particular community, that particular society. That one is the one that can be terminated through rebellion if government violates the contract, but not the initial one. And at the time when the instructor, the professor, was talking about there being two contracts, it didn't make that much sense to me at the time. It does now. Because during the Revolution, many of the more conservative people within the colonies, and the name that's coming to mind immediately is Alexander Hamilton. But I can think more specifically of people like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who really was the architect of the Articles of Confederation government. What many of these more conservative people were afraid of is that once you declared independence from England, the general public would believe that we were back in the state of nature, that all rules, all regulations, all laws were suspended, were terminated, and we were back into a state of nature. And the fact of the matter is, their position was, we can replace one government with the other, but that doesn't necessarily constitute a return to the state of nature and a revisiting of the initial social contract which brought man out of the state of nature. So I think that is significant. But back to John Locke on charity, and I know we've only got a minute before we reach the top of the hour, so we'll take a couple of minutes and do this. This is what Locke says on charity in his first treatise on civil government. And again, there were two. The second treatise is the structure of government and the conditions under which people have the right to terminate government and all the rest of it. The first treatise is an argument against absolute government. In other words, it is Locke's case that no government has the right to be absolute and to dictate the rules, the law, to the people under it. That the people under it should have a say, that it should be a popular government, and that the consent of the government has authority. That's the first treatise on civil government. And it's in part 4, chapter 4 of that particular treatise that Locke addresses the issue of charity. And he says that God has left no man to the mercy of another that he may starve him if he please. God never intended that one person would have so much power over another person that they could literally starve them if it pleased him. God said, Locke said that God, the Lord and Father of all, has given no one of his children that kind of power. But he did give his needy brother a right to the surplusage of his goods, so that it cannot be justly denied him when his pressing wants call for it. God gave no man the power over the life and death of another, but he did give the poor a right to whatever they needed to survive. And that those needs would be satisfied. Those needs would be satisfied from the surplus by taking from those who had more than they need. And the poor had a right to it. It was not up to the owner whether or not they got it. It was up to the person who needed it to take it. So we in our contemporary society, in a modern society, we have redefined charity by giving the giver the power to make the choice. Locke says that there is no choice, that the poor have a right to what they need to survive, and it's the responsibility of the community to give it, to provide it. And therefore, Locke says, it cannot justly be denied him when his pressing wants call for it. And therefore, no man could ever have a just power over the life of another by right of property in land or possessions, since it would always be a sin in any man of estate to let his brother perish for want of affording him relief out of his plenty. As justice gives every man a title to the product of his honest industry, in other words, justice gives you the right to own what you work for, what you mix your labor with, and gives man the right to the fair acquisitions of his ancestor descended to him. If your family or your father left you property, left you wealth, you have a right to that. If that's true, so charity gives every man a title to so much of another's plenty as will keep him from extreme want, where he has no means to subsist otherwise. And a man can no more justly make use of another's necessity to force him to become his vassal, by withholding that relief God requires him to afford to the wants of his brother, than he that has more strength can seize upon a weaker, master him to his obedience, and with a dagger at his throat offer him death or slavery. In other words, just as you cannot use the fact that you have, and some don't, as power over those people who don't. In other words, Locke is specifically saying it's not up to you whether you provide help to those in need. And therefore, since it's not up to you, you have no right to dictate the terms. You have no right to dictate drug tests for welfare, for example. Locke is saying, you have no right to dictate the terms under which people who are in need can claim what they need to survive. You have no right to dictate those terms to the poor. They have a right, as a member of the community, to what they need to survive. And theoretically, it comes from those who have more than they need and can afford it. If that's true, if you take Locke at his word, then when the social contract is entered into, when a community is created, and a government was created to govern that community, then it stands to reason that the government that is created would have a right, a power, to make sure that the poor have what they need. And that power to determine what they need and under what terms they will get it is beyond even government's right. The poor have a right to what they need to survive, period, says John Locke. I think this is incredibly important. Well, we have gone beyond the top of the hour. We are now 7 minutes after the top of the hour. I didn't plan my timing too well on that one, did I? But anyway, let's pause for 5 minutes, take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll still have 50 minutes of our second hour left here at the Virtual Center. So please stay with us. We'll pause for a 5-minute break. We'll be right back. Thank you.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here again is Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for the music. That was beautiful.
That was
this time of year.
Héctor Villalobos.
Oh God, it's gorgeous.
I thought it would be a nice respite from the ho 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 and the sleigh bells, and
it's beautiful.
We're done with that. It's, I love the Christmas music when it starts up. The day after Halloween now. God,
you're right.
I love it for a while, but by the time you're done with Christmas, you're like, okay, we can turn this off now.
My wife has been watching Christmas music since October, Christmas movies on Hallmark since October.
My favorite Christmas movie, we watched it Christmas evening, is it's a little known one, which makes it more fun to watch because I know it's not going to be on TV anywhere. Christmas in Connecticut.
Oh, I remember that, Bob. I do remember that. Barbara
Stanwyck.
Yes.
A deeply underappreciated actress.
Yep.
And a lovely comedy with some madcap, zany, screwball twists.
Uh-huh.
And just and it's black and white, and it is absolutely masterfully done.
Wonderful. Yeah. We watched Miracle on 34th Street twice during the holiday season. I do love that, especially Edmund Gwynn as St. Nicholas. I just love it. But anyway,
and for the modern stuff, you can't beat Chevy Chase's National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, and Bill Murray in Scrooged.
Yeah,
that's a dandy. Well, I'll let you get back to business.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate it. Welcome back to our second hour here at the Virtual Center on this Monday. It is the 28th day of December in the year 2015. If you are just joining us, we want to thank you. I'd like to thank you for being with us. If you've been with us through this entire program today, then I particularly want to thank you because you're still there, and I do appreciate that. You were here. If you were here with us in our first hour, you were here when John called and asked a question about property ownership and whether, in fact, it was absolute or not, which it seemed to me was a perfect lead-in to John Locke's continued role for community, and the the clear point that so many people who seek to use John Locke to justify their positions on individual freedom and property ownership and limited government and all the rest of it are more than comfortable totally ignoring or dismissing the role that Locke has for community and how important it is to Locke. And all the time in the background, I think, is we must keep in mind the point that Bob Kincaid made on Tuesday's program when he reminded us just at this point that Margaret Thatcher made the point that there's no such thing as community. And what that means is if there's no such thing as community, we are just a bunch of self-interested, greedy individuals who need to be managed and need to be controlled. And that says an awful lot. It seems to me. Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We would love to hear from you. If you would like to call in, if you are inclined to do so, I want you to know how much we would welcome hearing from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. And, of course, we know 4676 on your keypad is HORN, H-O-R-N. If you would like to email me directly and share your ideas one-on-one, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's W-A-O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. And again, I do remind you that we have a Facebook page devoted to the Virtual Center. If you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to our Facebook page. And on it, you will see a posting that I put last evening, which is pretty much a summary of a good portion of our first hour today. It's an effort. It was an effort to summarize our program last Tuesday. And since we began with a review of that program in our first hour, and John, of course, called in and kind of fed right into it beautifully with his comments on property and community and the fact that you really never totally own your own property and all the rest of it. I think it worked beautifully into the review of last Tuesday's program. So again, I do encourage you to check out the Facebook page and to feel comfortable to comment or make comments or suggestions or whatever based on materials that were there. Most of what's there is driven very, very much by what we've done and what we will be doing here at the Virtual Center. At the end of our first hour, just before we took our break, we were looking at the paragraph on charity by John Locke. And John Locke, and I'm going to pick this up because a few things have occurred to me when we took our 5-minute break that I think all of us need to spend time thinking on it. If it didn't occur to you, it did to me. John Locke makes the point in his chapter 4 paragraph on charity, which occurs in his first treatise on civil government, that the right of the poor to what they need is not the prerogative of the giver, it's the prerogative of the person in need. And whatever changes there are in the meaning of charity are changes that we have created from the time that John Locke wrote his treatise, his first treatise. Locke's position is that as a member of the community, everybody in it is entitled to what they need to survive. And it is not the prerogative of anybody or any group of people in the community to dictate the terms of fulfilling those particular needs. And And we quoted directly from Locke, and I have the paper right in my hand. Just as justice gives every man a title to the product of his honest industry, Locke says, and the fair acquisitions of his ancestor descended to him, so charity gives every man a title to so much out of another's plenty as will keep him from extreme want, where he has no means to subsist otherwise. The power is in the hands of the receiver, not the giver. The responsibility to comply is in the person, in the peoples of the community, in the plenty that exists within the community. Locke concludes by saying, and a man can no more justly make use of another's necessity to force him to become his vassal. By withholding that relief God requires him to afford to the wants of his brother. Let me say that again. Man has no right to withhold that relief God requires him to afford to the wants of his brother. Then he that has more strength can seize upon a weaker, master him to his obedience, and with a dagger at his throat offer him death or slavery. You do not, as the giver, you do not have the right to dictate the terms of the gift. It is not a gift that you choose to give. It is a right that the person in need has the power to take. And so the first question that occurred to me after we had took our break is, what kind of a society would that entail? How could you maintain a society of law and order and stability and progress if people were taking what they claimed they needed? It would seem to me you would have a total breakdown in everything that we define as order. How do you deal with that? It seems to me the answer to that question is that as a government, as spokesman for the community, as that agency empowered with the will of the community to fulfill the obligations of the community to provide for the common good, then it is your responsibility to make sure that that kind of need never exists within your community. It seems to me the way to prevent the disorder that would come with people taking what they claimed they needed was to make sure that that situation never arises. And theoretically, if you as government were really providing for the common good, it never would arise. So what's happened? I would suggest to you what has happened is that those with the power and the influence and the surplusage, the plenty out of which the needs of the poor will be satisfied, have been able to use their influence and power over government to redefine the entire situation, to rewrite the equation. And charity has become the prerogative of the giver. And charity has become the obligation of those with to care for those without. But associated with the right to bestow charity also is included the right to dictate the terms under which that charity can be and will be bestowed. In other words, we claim the right to dictate the terms. Whether it's the IDs they carry, whether it's the requirements that they must fulfill, whatever it is, the entire equation has been turned around. And I would argue that government has allowed itself to fall under the influence of the few in direct contradiction to its obligation to care for the many. Because that's the only way. If government really put the priorities of the many, the common good first, then there would not be situations and circumstances which would call into being this kind of a situation that Locke describes, where those in dire need would be required to exercise their right to take. So I really believe that this is incredibly, incredibly important. No wonder Margaret Thatcher doesn't want us to believe that there's such a thing as community. No wonder people don't want us to understand it or appreciate it or understand its importance. No wonder we go out of our way to attack those who put the emphasis on community as socialists, as communists, as bearers of evil. Because they would take positions contrary to the sanctity of individual freedom and individual rights. No wonder there is a whole ideological movement from the right, if you will, driven by what is called the natural rights philosophy, which puts a premium on natural rights of individuals and effectively dismisses as non-existent the reality of community, and instead seeks to promote the idea that we are not a community. We are a conglomeration of individuals with rights which must be respected. I'm struck, and this is kind of a natural transition, and I must admit that I didn't plan it this way. But it works perfectly into this. One of the articles, an article that I read, actually, it's in today's Washington Post. It's an op-ed piece in today's Washington Post. It's an article by E.J. Dionne. And the title of it is Bernie Sanders Lessons for Capitalists. And this piece by E.J. Dionne, who's a regular columnist in the Washington Post, addresses Bernie Sanders as a democratic socialist. And Dionne is playing with the word socialist, but more specifically, he's talking about what he perceives as a distinct difference between Bernie Sanders' claim to be a democratic socialist and others of the left who describe themselves as social democrats. And Dionne's position is that Bernie Sanders is really more of a social democrat than he is a socialist. And he cites Bernie Sanders in a speech earlier this year at Georgetown University, in which he addressed this issue of socialism. And Bernie Sanders said, quote, "The next time you hear me attacked as a socialist, remember this. I don't believe government should own the means of production. But I do believe that the middle class and the working families who produce the wealth of America deserve a fair deal," unquote. And Dionne, in response to that, says, "Honestly, Bernie, you're really a social democrat." The issue that I wanted to raise that seems to fit logically into where we are here in today's program is the issue of globalization that E.J. Dionne takes up after this. He points out a conflict, a moral conflict, that seems to exist as a result of today's emphasis on globalization, on the extent to which worldwide market capitalism, free market capitalism, is playing a role in attacking poverty around the world. And it creates a dilemma, especially for those in the wealthier nations like ours. Because social democrats liberals, if you will, created from the New Deal on an opportunity for working people to move into a standard of living that we have defined and that Bernie Sanders defines as middle class. In other words, there's no question that the New Deal programs that came out of World War II, pre-World War II, and after, helped to create the largest, most successful middle class in the history of the world. And it's that middle class right now that's being pummeled, that's being pounded. Because many of the jobs, the well-paying jobs that went into the standard of living that this middle class enjoys, are being lost here in America because they're being relocated to other parts of the world, obviously from the employer's point of view, in order to pay lower wages and break unions and all the other things we've talked about. But Dion's position is, in this article, that there's no question that globalization, the expansion of free enterprise capitalism, has seriously reduced poverty in large parts of the world, but at the expense of the quality of life here in America and other developed nations in Europe that was achieved at the behest or through the efforts of so-called social democrats. Liberalism created a standard of living in the developed world, which is being hammered by the increased emphasis on globalization. And the fact of the matter is that the very inequality that gave rise to social democracy in the first place, that brought progressivism into being in America, and led to the kind of reforms that made it possible for the expansion and growth of a sizable middle class here in America and throughout Europe. The same inequality which gave rise to those reforms is returning as a result of the emphasis on globalization. Equality, equity, if you will, is disappearing, and inequality is returning as globalization happens. And so what E.J. Dion's thesis is, or theme is in this article, is it seems to be true, it appears, that the time is ripe for some other reform response to the inequities being generated and created by globalization. Social democracy as we know it was the response to the inequality of the late 19th century, of the Industrial Revolution. Now we are seeing a return to inequality that's being spurred largely by the idea of globalization, which is in truth minimizing poverty in large parts of the world. But it's coming out of the hide of people here who are falling back in ways that many people see as immoral. I think it provides, and this is what Dion's article does. He mentions a book, and obviously I haven't read the book. It doesn't even come out until for a couple of more weeks, I believe. It's scheduled to come out later in January or February of this year. It's a book by Stephen Weissman, and Stephen Weissman is at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He's written a new book, and the title of the book is The Great Trade-Off: Controlling Moral Conflicts in the Era of Globalization. And Dion says, and Stephen Weissman, by the way, was at the New York Times for a number of years, so I think that's probably a way that E.J. Dion is able to connect with him. But according to Dion, this book by Stephen Weissman provides an excellent text for the discussions we need. And then he provides a couple of examples from this book that's not even out yet. And I think these quotations are worth looking at. Here's one. Globalization has elevated the living standards of hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people worldwide. But it has helped suppress the incomes of low-skilled middle-class workers in rich countries, unquote. So the question that quote raises, where do our loyalties lie? How do we balance obligations to our fellow citizens in the communities and countries in which we live against the interests of those people far away? How do the vast disparities of wealth that the system creates constrain the very process of democratic deliberation over what to do about it? In other words, we are entering a new world, Weissman says, Dion says. The world that is being created by the globalization impact, by the impact of globalization, by the expansion of free market capitalism. Piketty, in his monumental book of a couple of years ago on 21st century capital, Piketty made the point through the research and the data he presents in endless charts and graphs that inequality is inherent in capitalism. And so therefore, as capitalism spreads through globalization, it stands to reason that so also does the inequality which is included or embedded within it. And that inequality is particularly hitting the low-skilled middle classes in developed nations like ours. The last time such inequality emerged was in the 19th century as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Progressivism, social democracy, which took hold through the 20th century, was able to generate the largest and highest quality living standards for a middle class in the world up to that time. It was able to blunt a lot of the worst aspects of globalization, of industrialism. Now we are facing a new challenge on a global scale. What kind of changes do we make and how do we make them? How do we balance the best interests of our own people against the rights of the people of the world? Or can we? Are we confronted with a situation that used to be defined as Fortress America? Is Donald Trump right? Do we just need to put up walls and keep others out in order to keep what we've got here for ourselves? Is that the answer? In the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si last June, the Pope addressed this very issue, I believe. And he basically talked about including the moral question in economic decision making. His insistence was that those making the major decisions affecting globalization, affecting the global economy, needed to make those with the concerns of humankind on the table. The Pope's position was that no longer can we afford to make these decisions separate from their effect, their impact on people. That the impact on people needs to be part of the decision. And if a decision that seems to be logical economically has serious moral implications for people that will be affected by that decision, the Pope's position is that decision ought not to be made. It's a bad decision. And we have seen the effects of reaction to the Pope's encyclical since that time. Another quote from Weissman's book: "The global economic system should be one in which opportunities are more equal, the distribution of rewards is fairer, and the preservation of communities is more respected." How do we achieve these goals? How do we revisit the idea of the concept of a social contract? How do we enter into the kind of an agreement which takes the best interests of people seriously and takes economic decision-making out of the exclusive sphere that is separate from the needs of people? I think this is the issue that Weissman raises in his soon-to-be-published book. If you go online, you can see summaries of the book, reviews of the book. Obviously, you are not going to see reactions to the book because it's not out yet. I think it's due to come out sometime in January of 2016. But obviously, this is really the theme of Weissman's attention in that book. This is also the theme of Dion's article in today's Washington Post. And it fits so well into the theme that we've been pursuing here on the issues of community responsibility in light of private rights to property and to wealth. Isn't it unbelievable that in all the history that has happened since John Locke wrote his treatises in the late 17th century, not 18th century, 17th century. Remember, John Locke wrote his treatises in late 17th century England in order to justify the Glorious Revolution of 1689 against the absolute power of the king in Great Britain. The so-called Glorious Revolution of 1689 was the time in which Parliament really achieved some power in government in Great Britain. Up to that time, the power of the king was to be absolute. So Locke's two treatises were, the first one, an attack on absolute government. The second one, a justification for popular representative government, the power of Parliament to dictate the needs of the community as opposed to the right of the king to do it. There's no question that that particular revolution, what we call the Glorious Revolution, which is obviously our term, is significant because it involved the political transition from the developed world of the agricultural past to the world of commerce, expansion, and the idea of the free market that was just beginning to happen. And so, in a sense, the Glorious Revolution was a political change that adjusted to the kinds of economic and social changes that were occurring in England at that time. But the point I'm trying to make is Locke's treatises were not written in the abstract. They were not written in a vacuum. They were written with a political agenda in mind. They were written to justify the kinds of political changes that were happening in England at the time. And the first thing you had to do was attack the old before you could defend the new. And that's really the explanation of Locke's two treatises. We have obviously chosen to adopt the second treatise because we and our founders were able to use it, to a degree at least, in justifying our own independence from the mother country. Obviously, in this country, we really didn't have much of a need for the first treatise on the attack against authoritarian absolute government, because in this country we never theoretically ever had it. But the point I'm trying to make is we can't assume that because the second treatise was more important to us than the first one, we can't assume that that difference is absolute, that the second treatise is more important than the first one. I think we have to assume that in Locke's mind, the first one was as important as the second one because it led logically to it. And when you go to the first treatise, that's where you find this paragraph on charity in chapter 4. And it seems to me to raise some serious questions. But again, the legitimacy of the questions is based on the fact that so many people choose to use Locke to justify their own positions on limiting government and promoting individual freedom, as explained in the second treatise. But coincidentally with that, they choose to dismiss or repress or downplay the significance of community in John Locke in order to emphasize the idea of individual rights. And I think that's where the issue began, and I think that's the reason why there's so much controversy continuing on this particular issue. I really believe, I've got to say this whole idea, this whole theme of the extent to which history is written by the people who have the power to dictate what's in it. I can remember when I went to graduate school, one of the things we were made very aware of in the 18th century, in our research in the 18th century, was a recognition that the people who left letters, the people who wrote letters like Madison and Jefferson and Washington and Franklin and John Adams and all the rest of them, these were not your average working people. These were the elite. They left the letters. So by definition, writing the history of that period on what's in those letters means that the history you write is going to be an elitist history. It's very difficult to get at the sense or the understanding or the wants of the people who didn't leave records, who didn't have time to write and leave this kind of detailed analysis of government and politics and economics and social institutions and all the rest of it. So by definition, the history that we were writing was skewed. And at the time that I was in graduate school, which was in the 60s and late 60s and early 70s, 1960s and 70s. There was, at the time, a lot of faith, a lot of promise in data, in the ability to generate data. This was the beginning of the computer age, of the information age. And at the time that I was doing my research, there was an awful lot of attention being given to the issues of what we call roll call analysis, where we now had the ability to go in and look at the votes on particular laws that were up for debate and see who voted with whom, how often certain people voted with other people, in order to determine whether real parties, real factions or interest groups were developing, by determining accurately the number of times that specific individuals voted with other individuals. And at the time, there was a lot of promise on data, because the assumption is that quantitative data would give us the information about average people, that those people didn't leave us, that it was still possible to understand where they were coming from and what they wanted by looking at demographic data, by looking at tax data, by looking at the payment of property taxes, by seeing who lived where, what tax levels were like, what the priorities of particular regions were like based on who lived there and how much taxes they paid. In other words, the idea was that it was possible to get into the heads of the average people in order to figure out where they were coming from when there was no other way to do it, because they didn't leave letters, they didn't leave records. It's important every once in a while, it seems to me, to pinch yourself and remind yourself of that fact. One of the things that we've been doing here at the Virtual Center is looking at the letters of Jefferson, the letters of Madison, the letters of Hamilton. We've been looking at the Federalist Papers and all the rest of it. We need to understand that we are getting the ideas and the wisdom of a very elite group, the best educated groups of Americans. And we are drawing conclusions based on that fact. It's important, it seems to me, that we never lose sight of that fact. It's 58 minutes after the hour. I think it's time for us to wind up today's program. We never did get into the depth in detail of John Locke's treatment of property. I'd like to begin tomorrow's program by pursuing that, by looking a little bit at how John Locke saw private property, how John Locke saw the relationship between private property and the so-called commons, and how he explained the limitations on private property and how you continue to represent the interests of the commons in the face of privatization of portions of the commons. But we'll take all that up tomorrow. Right now, it's time to say good evening. We're at 1 minute, it's 59 minutes after the hour. I want to thank those of you who tuned in today, and I hope that you have a wonderful evening. And take care of yourself so that you can come back and join us tomorrow, another day, here at the Virtual Center. I want to thank you for tuning in. Be kind to each other. Be safe. And thank you.